So just to say a bit about the format, the goal of this series is to hear about faculty members in a way that you wouldn't ordinarily by glancing at their CV or stalking them on the internet. So we'll ask some questions to get things started, and Joe will talk to us about his life and intellectual journey. And at the end, we're going to save 10-15 minutes for questions. Anyone is welcome to ask a question if you wish. So as we're going along, if there's a burning question you have, keep that in mind, and we'll return to it at the end. I'm going to start off by just giving a brief introduction, and then we'll just jump right into the interview. So Dr. Kable began his career at Emory University, where he received a BS in chemistry. He later went on to receive his PhD in neuroscience here at the University of Pennsylvania. Then, after a postdoc at NYU, he returned to the University of Pennsylvania in 2008, where he has since risen through the ranks and is now a full professor with appointments in both psychology and marketing. He studies human decision-making broadly construed, but is perhaps most famous for being a leader in the field of the neural basis of decision-making. He's won numerous grants and awards at virtually every stage of his career. I won't highlight all of those, but instead I want to bring attention to just one. In 1996, Dr. Kable won the Lucius Lamar McMullen Award, which is a $20,000 award given to the undergraduate at Emory in the graduating class, not for their intellectual achievements, but for their leadership and citizenship achievements. As an Emory alum myself, I can say that this is indeed a very prestigious award, and it speaks volumes to who Joe is as a person. In fact, I just recently learned the other day that not only did he receive this award, he was the very first person to receive this award, which makes me think that the administration at Emory, as soon as Joe arrived on campus, must have been scrambling to find a way to honor someone for their very significant achievements. So, yeah, on that note, join me in welcoming Dr. Joe Kable. So just a simple question to get us started. I just talked about your journey from college onward, but what about before that? What led you to going to Emory? What led you to studying chemistry? How'd you get there?
Sure. So we moved around when I grew up, but I mostly grew up in Omaha, Nebraska. I was the oldest of 7 kids. My youngest brother was born when I was 15, so that's the span, 15-year span, 7 kids in the middle of there. When I was in high school, thinking about what I want to do with my life, I knew that I wanted to get out of Nebraska. That was one thing. And, we were, my father was a physician. He worked at the Creighton University, which is in Omaha. So we were pretty well off, but we had 7 kids, and so my dad's attitude was, I took this job because you get free college. Like, if you want to go somewhere else, you gotta, like, somebody's gonna pay for it. Like, I'm not. Don't look at me. And so my search for where to go to college really centered on how can I get it paid for, and that's how I ended up at Emory. As an Emory alum, you might know Emory has a very robust scholarship program. A lot of it, I joke that my college was paid for by the Coca-Cola company, and I've been paying them back ever since with the Diet Coke a day. That's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but most of the scholarships there are funded by people who made their money through Coca-Cola. And because I got a scholarship there, that's why I ended up at Emory. And while I was there, I didn't know. I had no idea what I wanted to be when I grew up. That was not. I had a sense that, like many people who were first years in college, I thought maybe I wanted to be a doctor, and my dad was a doctor, and I knew that. And so I took organic chemistry as a freshman, and I did really well in it. And then I realized that I could finish a chemistry major with 1 class a semester for the rest of my time at Penn, and that would then give me an opportunity to take lots of other courses that I wanted to take. And so I that was, I'm a bit embarrassed to say, the main reason why I chose to be a chemistry major. I mean, I enjoyed chemistry, but it also seemed like a path that left a lot of other things open. But I hadn't really thought about research when I was a second-year student. I think somebody handed me, one of my professors handed me a brochure for a RU program that summer at Brown University and said, you need to apply for this. And that sounded like a good idea to me. The summer after my first year in college, I worked as a telemarketer, because telemarketing is one of the biggest businesses in Omaha. They like the accent that you're hearing. And so they're all, before they were shipped outside of the US, they were shipped to the Midwest. And that experience was enough for me to know that I absolutely wanted to find some other job that summer. I was lucky enough to get into the RU program, and that was a lot of fun. I think that was my first real research experience. I had done some, week-long things as a high school student, but the RU was the first time I'd been in a lab.
And what kind of lab? What kind of research was it?
So it was a chemistry lab. It was organic chemistry. That was what I knew at that point in time. We were doing it was organic and biochemistry, and but the piece of it that I really enjoyed was, you woke up every morning and solved problems. Like, it was like, this is awesome. Like, you just get up every morning and solve problems. Like, this sounds fun. And then, I also had the good fortune coming back to Emory that, again, a professor took me under his wing and was like, here's the list of all the faculty in the chemistry department. Pick one, I'm going to introduce you to them, and you're going to do independent research. And I was like, okay. And that's how I ended up doing neurochemistry research with Jay Justice. And I did that my junior year. I did that over the summer, my senior year, before my senior year. I did that through my senior year, and then the summer after my senior year. And yeah, now the intro elides jumps straight from the undergrad, the bachelor's in chemistry, to I did a PhD in neuroscience at Penn, which ignores the fact that those were not continuous. Nor when I graduated from Penn did I really ever think that I would do a PhD in neuroscience. So you mentioned the McMullen Award. When I was in college, half of my life junior and senior year was, or a good portion of my life junior and senior year was doing research in the chemistry lab. But a lot of what I did in college, I was the director of volunteer memory my senior year, ran the alternate spring break program. We ran a weekly, I was very involved in housing and homelessness issues, and we ran a weekly trip to a weekly program with one of the homeless shelters. I did a fair bit of activist work that, since this is recorded, I'll just refer to rather than give you the details. And so when I graduated, like I wasn't, I didn't really know what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And the Mullen Award really gave me the opportunity to actually think about that and explore options. And so what I did after graduation was I was, trying to figure it. I was searching mostly for a few months, and did a road trip around the U.S., eastern side of the U.S. And I found a program called Visions in Action, which is the analogy, I think, to give you, it's a small program, but I think the analogy would be it's like the Peace Corps, but one of the things that they do is they place you with local organizations in the country that you go to. And they worked in South Africa, which at the time, this is the mid-90s, they were one of the only organizations that were in South Africa that was just after the end of apartheid. That sounded like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And so, I would say from college graduation for 2 or 3 years, if you asked me what I was doing, I would not say. Like, if there was academia was not, that was not the direction I was imagining. So I say we. The reason why this aligns, that jump aligns so much in my life is, so one of the people I met while I was in South Africa is now my wife. And she's American, but was on the same program. And we lived there for close to 2 years. I was working in one of the community organizations in one of the townships. For those of you who maybe don't know South African history, I mean, basically it was, apartheid was forced segregation. So all of the black South Africans lived basically in defined areas outside of the city. And in the 90s, when Mandela took power, the biggest issue was how do we take what was never meant to be a place where people lived, really. It was meant to house people, and how do we turn that into robust communities? And so that was what that organization was doing. I think at some point, I don't know if any of you are immigrants, or were not born in the US, but I think at some point in that experience, I came to the realization that if I'm going to continue I am not from here, and if I'm going to continue to do this work, I either need to choose to be from here, or I need to, go back and do something where I'm from. And that was basically what led me to, Jen and I partly what led us to decide to go back to the US and figure out, so I was back to searching, what am I going to do now? And again, I've had tremendous luck in people taking me by the hand and sort of, helping me out along the way. And so when I came back, I think that was when I decided I wanted to go to graduate school. It was, I managed to get a job at the Nebraska Medical Center, again in neuroscience research. That was, somebody who was a friend of the family, and sort of took pity on the fact that I knew nothing about interviewing for jobs, and it was like, your undergraduate record looks great. So I'm going to forgive the fact that you totally bombed the interview and gave you this job as a research assistant. And then I applied for graduate school from there. it's a little bit, so at Emory, you've been at Emory more recently than I have. I had started I took a neuroscience graduate course as an undergrad, and at that point in time, what was the cutting edge was positron emission tomography studies of human cognition. Like, this was just when Mark Rickle's group was coming out with the early PET studies. And so we read about that, and I went, one of the people on my chemistry, who was on my committee for honors chemistry, was in the psych department. So I got very excited about human neuroimaging, and I went and I talked to him, and I was like, oh, this sounds great, this is what I want to do. And he basically said, you don't want to waste your, like, this is a flash in the pan, like, you're never going to learn anything about the human brain studying it with neuroimaging, like, please don't do this to yourself. Like, you're a smart kid. Like, the way to make progress in neuroscience is by, running lots of experiments with rats. Like, that's how you be a real neuroscientist. And that was very discouraging to me. Part of the reason I think I didn't immediately go to neuroscience graduate school, because I was like, all right, well then, that sounded exciting to me, but I don't know what you're doing, doesn't sound so exciting to me. Which is funny, because now everybody in the psychology department at Emory does neuroimaging. So there's a scanner in the basement. So I try to remember that incident when I'm talking to my undergraduate students and they have an idea that I immediately think is maybe a little crazy, because it's like, no, actually, sometimes the enthusiasm that you see in the eyes of an 18 or 19-year-old who's like, this is really cool, you need to pay attention to it. And so, so I decided anyway that I was going to go off and do neuroimaging, despite being told that I shouldn't do that. I was reassured. One of my mentors at Emory was a philosophy professor. He's actually still there. Runs a center that's somewhat analogous to mine core, actually. It's a center for, or used to. He was the inaugural director of the Center for Mind, Bringing in Culture. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. And he was very. This is maybe another lesson. Like I never did anything super intellectual when I was basically a work study for him, and I wasn't doing intellectual work, right? Right? But yet nonetheless, that was a very valuable experience for me, just because, we would talk in between stuff, and he was able to give me the advice that I think helped reassure me that I was on the right track with this neuroimaging stuff. Most of what I did for him as a work study, it used to be that teachers taught by writing on transparencies with markers and projecting them onto the board for the young students in the crowd. And so what this generated was a bunch of transparencies that needed to be cleaned at the end of every class. And that was my job as the work study, was to come in, pick up the transparencies from his office and go and wash them off. And that, and then on some days I had to physically go to the library and copy the journal article that he wanted to read and bring it back to him. That was my work study job. But nonetheless, it led to me being able to talk to him. And one of the things I mentioned in passing was that I I was interested in neuroscience, and I was interested in human neuroimaging, but I was a little unclear about what. Like basically told him, nobody here seems to think that that's very interesting. What do you think? And he's like, no. I think actually there's that's interesting work, and here is, I just edited a book, and I worked with this guy. One of the people who wrote the chapters was this guy, Antonio Damasio, at the University of Iowa, and he's, written on this, so why don't you read some of the stuff that he's written, and that might give you a sense of what you want to do. And so when I came back, now we're coming back, so when I came back from South Africa, one of the books I read was Damasio's Descartes' Error, which for the neuroscience students in the room really was he repopularized the story of Phineas Gage. That book sort of, now everybody knows about Phineas Gage, but that book was the repopularization of the Phineas Gage story. And so I looked around for what places were doing neuroimaging research at this point. I think at that point the literature was small enough that I could read every paper that had ever been published using functional MRI. Yeah, so I read every single paper in about a week and made a list of people who were doing the work. Decided to come to Penn, in part because that was where I had the best interview. It seemed like the Penn students had the most balanced lives. Jen and I were also she was going to law school and was going to be on the East Coast, so Philadelphia was a good place to be then. And I showed up to grad school thinking that I was going to work with the faculty member who had read their papers from doing my research. And the day I showed up, I learned that they were leaving Penn. So I did it's the neuroscience program. I did another rotation doing work in animal models. That was enough to convince me that I appreciated that work intellectually, and I was glad it was being done, but I was not the person to be doing it. And so, at that point I was like, okay, I came here to learn neuroimaging, that's what I want to do. I spoke with, Penn had hired a couple of new assistant professors who did that, and spoke with a couple of them. They looked at me like, where did you come from? You haven't been a research assistant. You graduated 3 years ago. You're a chemistry major. You've never taken a psychology course in your life. So eventually, I would say it was about a semester from quitting graduate school at that point. But the person who I'd interviewed with, who was one of the people who developed fMRI and was the person who was leaving Penn, I basically just begged them, can I just rotate in your lab? I've never done this work before. I just want to know, is this, the kind of work that I want to be doing? He was like, okay, fine. But what he did was, the day one when I showed up for the rotation, he took me over to one of the new assistant professor, new hires in neurology, Anjan Chatterjee, who's still here. Some of you may know him, he's up on the 5th floor, and said, we just hired Anjan, he's a great guy, he studies human cognition, and he really wants to start doing neuroimaging, so why don't you work with him for your rotation, and my lab is still here, so you guys can use the resources in my lab to figure out how to do neuroimaging. And I say to graduate students, that the number one predictor of your graduate student experience, I say to potential graduate students, undergrads I'm already talking, the number one predictor of your graduate experience is your relationship with your advisor. And like that, I'm like, I know you're thinking about like 90 other things, like where do I want to live and which school, and I'm like, none of that matters. Like if you go somewhere and that relationship goes sour, it's going to be a bad experience, and you could go anywhere in the world, and if that relationship is a good relationship, you're going to have a good experience. And so, Anjan is a fantastic mentor, and I didn't even know his name when I applied to Penn, and he took pity on me as a rotation student, and that worked out. And so I did my thesis in neuroimaging of language and thought with Anjan.
How did you arrive at that, by the way? So you got from chemistry to an interest in neuroscience. How did you discover kinds of questions that you wanted to ask?
So I would say at that point I was still very interested in decision making, in part because I read Damasio's book. And so, but at that time, he was the only person who was asking questions in humans about decision making. And there weren't any neuroimaging studies of decision making. So part of my choice, and as I just explained, I didn't have many options in terms of, but that said, I found it fascinating. Like I hadn't really ever studied human cognition before, and so as soon as I got into that question, and the questions we were, Anjan's lab was asking was about an interface between perception and language, basically. Like what aspects of our knowledge of action concepts are inherited from perception, and what aspects are in a different format from sort of low-level perceptual format. And so I was I found it fascinating. And it was only after I finished my PhD that I looked around and there was an opportunity to start to do neuroimaging studies in decision making. And that's what led to the postdoc at NYU, and then the rest of the
So
my career.
You mentioned sort of struggling to find your way in the first part of graduate school. How did that ultimately come together? Was it just a matter of working with Anjan and everything was a perfect fit from then on? Was grad school smooth sailing, or were there still sort of challenges in that journey that were noteworthy?
Yeah, I think there are always, I don't know anyone who got grad school without challenge. I would say my grad school trajectory was a fairly typical one, in that once I found Anjan, and once it was like, this is Anjan's a great guy, we have a great relationship, I like this person as a person in addition to liking them as a scholar. This is a fascinating topic. I'm going to get a chance to learn the things that I want to learn. There were a couple of years that was like, I could not have been more happy about and then you kind of get to year 2, 3, 4 of grad school, and you're like, is this ever gonna, am I ever, I've been doing experiments for a long time, and many of them haven't worked. Like, I don't, is this ever, what's the end game here? So, there's a lull, and luckily I had, a good community to help pull me through. There was a nice community of grad students and fellows. We were, at that time, in what is now the hotel for the president of the university. It's next to the president's house over on 38th and Walnut, but it was an old Victorian, Martha, who you guys will meet, and this is her space, the Center for Neuroscience and Society. Had started the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience, and we were generously given this old Victorian, and there were 3 labs in the beginning, then soon 4 or 5 that populated it, and it was a nice environment. There was a lot of mixing of the different labs, and so I made a lot of friends in terms of other grad students and fellows. We also made a lot of friends with all the other animals that lived in the old Victorian. So there were, mice and squirrels that would come in from the outside. So I think I would, I definitely leaned on people to get through the low times in year 3, 4, 5, and then I think you see the light at the end of the tunnel once a couple experiments work and you get a paper published and you're like, okay, maybe I'm going to get a thesis together here, and you kind of push through from there towards the end.
And so then going into the, thinking about a postdoc, was the goal to focus more on decision making, or was that incidental?
No, that was very much the goal. I was a little constrained at that point. My oldest, Desi, was born a year after I got my PhD, and so I don't know when I got my PhD that we were planning to start a family, and Jen had a job in Philadelphia actually, so I was pretty geographically, I was like, okay, here, my ideal is I would like to study decision making and be near Philadelphia, which again is asking a lot, but I lucked out because my postdoctoral advisor, Paul Klemscher, was at NYU at that point. Paul he was mostly a non-human primate lab, but he wanted to start getting into human neuroimaging. I actually didn't know that. Somebody was able to refer me and say, no, he's starting an fMRI lab. Like, why don't you go, you know how to do fMRI, why don't you go work with him? I was lucky enough that Paul offered me a position that met all of those requirements that I was looking for.
It seems like there's been a lot of serendipity at each career stage. You've stumbled into this very effectively. Was there ever a point when you felt like, you mentioned there being a lull in graduate school, was there ever a point that you were like really convinced that you were dedicated to this career and you were confident in the academic career path? And if so, what was that, and what changed that trajectory?
I would say that I don't think I was fully confident that that academics was my career until I got a faculty position. Because I think even as a postdoc, certainly as a graduate student, there were lots of moments where I wasn't even sure, or not lots of moments, but there were definitely, there were particular moments during my PhD where I was not sure that I would even finish my PhD. maybe the answer to this is, like, you've done other things in your life, like you can do other things, like maybe the answer is to go do other things. And as a postdoc, I think, and this resonates with a lot of the postdocs I work with, like I think there's still that doubt about whether this is the right, whether you're going to remain in academia or maybe remain in research in another capacity. And certainly that was my, those thoughts were going through my head until the point that I got a faculty position. I was like, okay. And I think that, again, there was a bit of an upswing honeymoon period of, oh my God, I can't believe someone's going to pay me to do this. I can't believe, but yeah, I had what I would call a successful job search. So the first time I did a job search as a postdoc, I got one interview and did not get the job, and applied 15, 20 places. The second time I did a bigger search, I don't even want to count the number of applications I sent out, and had what I would call a successful faculty job search, in that I ultimately got 2 offers. But that required dozens of thank you for your application, but we're going a different direction. Required a large handful of visits to campuses that you're halfway through the visit and are like, okay, this is not going to work. And so there's a lot of failure before we get to the. So I would say I was did not fully inhabit an academic until I was an assistant professor.
I think one thing, I won't speak for all young people, I guess, but for me, as an undergraduate, I worked in the lab of an assistant professor who actually got tenure while I was in the lab. But one thing I didn't realize at the time was how important the period of being an assistant professor is, and all the challenges that come with that. So I wonder what your experience was like coming back to Penn. I guess you had some familiarity, which helped. What was it like building a lab? What are the challenges that come with that? What are the opportunities that come with that? How did you approach that period of your career?
Yeah. It was very exciting at the beginning to get that opportunity. It's a lot of stress because I think you're in an environment where it's kind of it's funny. You're in an environment where everybody in academia, like the value system of academia is, you need to get tenure, like that. This is obviously getting tenure at the University of Pennsylvania is the most important thing in the world. Like, why would you? Like, none of the messages that you get from your peers sort of question that this is, But that gets reinforced, and your vision narrows. So it's helpful for me every once in a while to go home and realize that the only reason my brothers and sisters know the difference between Penn and Penn State is because I'm a professor at Penn. So like now now they'll educate people about the fact that the University of Pennsylvania is not a state school; it's an Ivy League. But like nobody who I grew up with could give you those facts. Like and so. Yeah, but you're in this environment where that is the most important thing you can do. So it is a lot of it is a lot of stress. I used to think it was ridiculous what we asked of assistant professors, because basically the academic system is you are doing research every day, you're in a lab every day, you're doing experiments every day, and we take the people who are really good at doing experiments and getting results and writing papers, and then we say, okay, now you're not going to do any of that anymore. Now you're going to lead a team of people.
And you're going to be an accountant.
And you're going to be accountants, and you're going to be a marketing officer, and you're going to write grants. And so we're going to give you this job that has all this list of things that you can do, none of which you've ever done before. And we're just going to assume that because you were good at this, you're going to be good at that. Which, so there's a lot of, and I think we're better at this now. I hope we're better at this now or at least, our department is better at this, maybe as a field we're better at this, but, and we're not going to give you any training on any of these things that we're going to ask you to do. Like, just you were great at this, we're sure you can figure all of this out, go do it. And so, there's a lot you have to learn, like I've never selected graduate students before. I'd never hired anyone before. I'd never managed anyone before. I didn't, know how to be an accountant on a grant or anything like that.
How do you approach that kind of community building that goes along with this? I think that's an underappreciated part sometimes of running a lab. And as hearing you talk about all your other life experiences, a lot of parts in that journey were about, Anjan as a mentor was a good person, and you felt like there was a good fit in that way. Does that shape the way that you think about building your lab, and what's the philosophy there?
Yeah, I would say I had a lot of experiences in different labs over the years, and so I was able to kind of take from the different labs that I was in. I like this aspect of the lab world, and I didn't like that aspect. So let's try and sort of put together. But I think one of the things that all of my that I have appreciated about my mentors, and particularly is the fact that this is that first and foremost they think about the members of their lab as other people, and that this is a human enterprise, and that what Anjan would say to me when I was in graduate school is, this is great because I get to pick who I'm around. I like this job because I get to pick who I spend my time with, and that is incredible. That is what he thought of as one of the most incredible benefits of being, of running the lab, so I try and take that philosophy to heart. That the first thing I'm looking for when hiring someone, bringing on a fellow, bringing on a postdoc is this someone that the lab is going to want to be around every day?
I'll ask just a few more questions, and then we'll open it up to the broader group. So be thinking about what questions you have for Dr. Kable. But this is just my own personal belief, but I often think that many academics that I know, I feel like all have at least one sort of academic superpower, or one thing that they feel especially good at or confident doing, or something like this. Or do you feel like that's true in your career at all? Do you feel like there's ever been like some unique advantage, either something you think you're really good at, or some part of the career that you particularly enjoy engaging with that has contributed to your success in some way? You can decline to answer.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll think about that. Maybe my there's a couple of my students in the back. Maybe they can suggest what my what is what one of the things Anand said about me when I defend it, which I think is true, is that I have a tolerance for the drudgery of science, right? A lot of what you are supposed to do is, rerun that regression the 79th time, where you tweak the specification in just the right way, because you realize that when you ran the regression the 78th time, that it was wrong. And I'm sort of fine with, I have a little bit of a, detail-oriented streak, where I'm like, okay, fine, I can buckle down and do that for the 79th time. And sometimes I can drive the people in my lab crazy by asking for the 79th regression after they've already done the 78th regression. And they're like, what are you talking about? Uncle.
What about the flip side of this? Is there like any one aspect of this career that you found particularly frustrating or challenging or less enjoyable?
Well, I'll mention two. I mean, one is, I've never, I am a Midwesterner by continents, and so I've never been a loquacious person. So I've never in my career really been, writing has never been easy for me. I think I've gotten better at it over the years, but it doesn't come easy. And I don't think anybody enjoys it. Maybe some people enjoy it. But I think most people are, like, the review process of grants and academic papers. I have learned a lot of emotion regulation techniques over the years to be like, in order to get over that, so I just skim decision letters until it comes time to write the response, to actually sit down and write the response. Like, all I want to know is, where are we at, right? I'm not gonna, because if I read the details, it's just gonna send me into a loop of arguing with the reviewers. If I'll like all other PIs, I will be refreshing the NIH page on the day that my grant is reviewed, but I look at the score and then that's it. Right? It's like, is it going to be funded or is it not going to be funded? And if it's not going to be funded, I know it's not going to be funded, and I'm not going to engage with the critiques until it comes time to productively engage with the critiques. Just because otherwise, you're in this career, what you're thinking about when you're not actively working, it's like a resource that you need to protect, right? where my mind is daydreaming is a resource I need to protect, and if it's daydreaming about arguing with a reviewer too, like we're not moving forward. So.
I think that's one of the things that I often sort of struggle to convey to like family members who don't know how academia works, just how much it is failure after failure after failure. Even amongst wildly successful people, your inbox is filled with failures a lot. And I think, I will say, I think that, at least for me, has actually been the most effective way of teaching that sort of emotional regulation in response to bad news. Like I've gotten better at that from academia and translating that into my personal life. Just one
We're not very
question.
good at providing positive.
Yeah, we don't do that very well.
No.
Even when your paper's accepted, it's like, okay, we'll let you.
Yeah, it's like, congratulations, please.
Do more paperwork.
Please do. Here's the paperwork, and the margins need to be changed, and give us some money.
So one last question, then we'll open up. If you had advice for, let's say, an undergraduate student deciding whether to pursue a PhD, I think maybe your most important piece of advice you've already told us, which is to think about the fit with a mentor, which, by the way, I think is the exact right advice. But just more generally, you're deciding how to pursue an intellectual journey, forgetting the fit with your academic advisor. What advice would you have for someone who's embarking on potentially, 40, 50 years of studying how the mind works or whatever else it may be?
Yeah, well, so you got my first piece of advice, which is the number one determinant of your happiness in graduate school is your relationship with your advisor. I think the second piece of advice I'm going to steal from Sharon Thompson-Schill, because I think it's, I actually agree with it. Like what Sharon, when she was the director of undergraduate studies, would say to psych students who are thinking about graduate school is, well, first she would say, don't go directly to graduate school. Go do something else, go be a research assistant. And if what you should do is pay attention to what you want to do when you have what are you thinking about when you have a choice of what you want to think about? What are you reading when you have a choice about what you want to read? And if you find that you really enjoy reading about and thinking about psychology, like when it's not assigned, like that's the sign that you should, that's a sign that you should go do a psychology PhD. Because if you don't have the, as we've talked about, that there's a lot of setbacks along the way, and I think if you don't have that intrinsic, most of the professors I know, that they have this intrinsic desire to think about this stuff, right? Like if you stopped paying them, they would probably still do the same thing, right? Just because that's what they enjoy doing, right? And so, and I think you need that to really kind of persist through the setbacks along the way.
Okay, with that, we'll take questions from the audience. Yeah.
Hello, thanks for talking about your trajectory. Question I have for you is, reflecting back on your experiences in South Africa and the activist work you were doing, how does that inform and inspire the work that you do today?
That's a good question. I mean, I think for a long time, I think the answer for me, I mean, when I was in college, the answer for me was this is two different sides of my life, and two different parts of my identity. I think what I've come to realize as my career has passed is that you can that higher education as an institution is not perfect, and so there's work to be done here just as there's work to be done in other parts of society. And so I think that I think that has, it's come together a little bit more as opposed to just being, two very different parts of my identity that I juggle. Right?
Do you know anything about the neuroscience of apartheid?
Well, one of the things that we have started to study in the lab, and actually we just published a paper this past year with a postdoc in the lab, Kenji Kobayashi, and another faculty member in psychology, Anna Jenkins, on neural representations of stereotypes and how the brain represents our impressions of other people. And we're starting a line of work along those lines. Yeah, I mean, I think some of these things have come around in that there have been, what really was, maybe I want to do X, maybe I want to do Y. There's ways in which these things have weaved together over the years. Another line of work in the lab, which, so when I started as an assistant professor, I had a collaborator who was doing work in, one of the things I study in decision making is time preferences, so how people trade off more immediate versus more delayed rewards. And I had a collaborator who was working in South Africa looking at measuring time preferences there, seeing how the experience of living in a poor environment shapes people's time preference, the experience of living in an environment in which there were, in which, somebody can look it up, but it's somewhere between like 30 and 50% of the population. A huge portion of the population has HIV. Like, how does that shape your decisions about health in the future? And so that it's weaved back together over the years. I was not surprised at all when Li Wei, who was the collaborator, came back to me and said, you have this, well, I know that everybody uses this standard form for measuring time preferences, but we need to shift it in South Africa. Like, nobody's going to accept these delayed rewards. The delayed rewards have to be much higher. Like, everyone there is much more focused on shorter term, on the shorter term. And that did not surprise me at all, having worked there. And, and it's a rational response to the environment that you're in. And now that, it's come back around, right? So I have a graduate student who's writing a paper right now on socioeconomic status and time preferences, so.
Other questions?
Thank you so much for talking about your story and stuff. Very, very interesting. I guess this is a bit less connected to your personal experience, but as someone looking into going to grad school, what sort of qualities, I guess, do you look for or have you noticed in successful grad students, in people who have, I guess, flourished in grad school?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you what I look for. I can't tell. What I can't tell you is, is any of this really predictive? I mentioned earlier that there are things about academia that I'm like, why do we do this way? One of them is selection. I'm like, we talk a lot about who deserves to be a graduate student, and I'm like, I've been on the selection committee for graduate school, and I don't think that we know much of anything of what predicts who's going to be as successful in graduate school or not. I can say that what I look for is like we were just talking about in terms of the challenges that people face in graduate school. I look for some signs that I think people can face those challenges, that they're not going to be, that they're going to be able to handle a review or two and get up the next day and rewrite the paper. And that, that could be because they've done it before, right? They've been in a research lab and they know what they're getting into. But it could be something else that even if they don't have extensive amount of research experience, it could be something else that makes me think that they can, that this is what they want to be doing, and that they'll be able to face that. Oftentimes it's that people have shown through other, whether that's research experience as an undergraduate or work, that they can do it, but it doesn't have to be that. Looking for the quality of being able to wanting to do research and being able to push through when the paper comes back and you have to revise it and it's been rejected. So I was saying that I've always thought that that's a weird thing about academia, but I've now done enough kind of outside talking with people in other industries to know that these are universal problems. So one problem is that so I was if you go to the military, for example, one problem is that the military has is they take the men and women who are really good at kicking in doors and shooting guns and say, okay, great, you're great at that. Now we don't want you to do that anymore. What we want you to do is run a team of people. And it's like, and we're not going to give you any training on how to be a mentor or how to run a team of people. But because you are good at this thing, now you run the team of people who do that thing. And they're like, we're running into some problems, so organizing, and I'm like, yeah, this sounds familiar. And selection is the same way. Like, how do we pick who's going to be, a successful person in the military? I'm like, I don't have any answer from academia there.
We have time for one more question. If anyone has any thoughts?
Massive.
We'll call it there. All right. Thank you so much for listening. And that's all. And thank you for joining us.
Yeah.